Hello, my name's David Rawnsley. This is the second of 5 videos that share the mystical thoughts of some of our greatest scientists. As Nobel Prize recipients, they must also be recognised as some of the greatest scientists that mainstream science can muster. Werner Heisenberg was one of the co-creators of quantum mechanics. At the tender age of 24, he invented what was known as matrix quantum mechanics. At the same time, and working independently, Schrodinger developed a wave mechanics that gave equivalent answers, and they were collectively credited with creating quantum mechanics. Heisenberg was awarded his Nobel Prize when he was just 31 years old. He enjoyed philosophizing and was a mystic of the Pythagorean Platonic variety. He wrote this piece late in his life, when he was 70 years old, as part of his book Physics and Beyond. I chose this piece because it also includes, as quotes, the thoughts of both Johannes Kepler and Wolfgang Pauli. Of course, Kepler was long before Nobel Prizes. Pauli received his for his contribution to quantum mechanics in 1945, after being nominated by Einstein. Enjoy these thoughts on beauty from 3 great scientists. Heisenberg begins. Perhaps it will be best if, without any initial attempt at a philosophical analysis of the concept of beauty, we simply ask where we can meet the beautiful in the sphere of exact science. Here, I may be allowed to begin with a personal experience. When I was a small boy, I was attending the lowest classes of the Max Gymnasium here in Munich. I became interested in numbers. It gave me pleasure to get to know their properties, to find out, for example, whether they were prime numbers or not, and to test whether they could perhaps be represented as sums of squares, or eventually to prove that there must be infinitely many primes. Heisenberg's father had bought him a book in Latin to help him improve his Latin, but it turned out to be a book about mathematics. I sensed a quite immediate beauty in the fact that, from the problem of partitioning a circle, whose simplest cases were of course familiar to us in school, it was possible to learn something about the totally different sort of questions involved in elementary number theory. Far in the distance, no doubt, there already floated the question whether whole numbers and geometric forms exist, that is, whether they are outside the human mind or whether they have merely been created by the human mind as instruments for understanding the world. But at the time, I was not yet able to think about such problems. The impression of something very beautiful was, however, perfectly direct. It required no justification or explanation. This raised the question for Heisenberg as to what was beautiful, and he went in search of an answer with the early Greek philosophers. There were 2 quite different interpretations of beauty. On the one hand, it was all the parts coming together to make a whole, a bit like a new car in that all the parts fit perfectly to create a machine that can travel at great speed. The other camp ignored the parts and focused on the whole, suggesting that it is the beauty of the car itself that evokes a reaction in our soul far beyond the coming together of the parts. For Heisenberg, then, beauty is therefore involved with the age-old problem of the one and the many, which occupied, in close connection with the problem of being and becoming, a central position in Greek philosophy. Heisenberg called on the wisdom of Kepler and Pauli, a friend of psychologist Carl Jung, when it came to trying to understand what is it that shines forth in these structures, how the great connection is recognized even before it is rationally understood in detail. He began with an extract from Kepler's Harmony of the Worlds. That faculty which perceives and recognizes the noble proportions in what is given to the senses and other things situated outside itself must be ascribed to the soul. It lies very close to the faculty which supplies formal schemata to the senses, or deeper still, and thus adjacent to the purely vital power of the soul, which does not think discursively, that is, in conclusions as the philosophers do, and employs no considered method, and is thus not peculiar only to man, but also dwells in wild animals and the dear beasts of the field. Now it might be asked how this faculty of the soul, which does not engage in conceptual thinking, can therefore have no proper knowledge of the harmonic relations, should be capable of recognizing what is given in the outside world. For to recognize is to compare the sense perception outside with the original pictures inside, and to judge that it conforms to them. Proclus has expressed the matter very finely in his simile of awakening as from a dream. For just as the sensorially presented things in the outer world recall to us those which we formerly perceived in the dream, so also the mathematical relations given in sensibility call forth those intelligible archetypes which were already given inwardly beforehand, so that there now shines forth truly and vividly in the soul, where before they were only obscurely present there. But how have they come to be within? To this I answer that all pure ideas are archetypal patterns of harmony, such as we are speaking of, are inherently present in those capable of apprehending them. But they are not first received into the mind by a conceptual process, being the product rather of a sort of instinctive intuition of pure quality, and are innate in these individuals just as the number of petals in a plant, say, is innate in its form principle, or the number of its seed chambers is innate in the apple. Heisenberg goes on to introduce similar thoughts from Pauli, who in his own turn referred back to Kepler. The process of understanding in nature, together with the joy that man feels in understanding, that is, in becoming acquainted with new knowledge, seems therefore to rest upon a correspondence, a coming into congruence of pre-existent internal images of the human psyche with external objects and their behaviour. This view of natural knowledge goes back, of course, to Plato, and was also very plainly adopted by Kepler. The latter speaks in fact of ideas pre-existent in the mind of God and imprinted accordingly upon the soul as the image of God. These primal images, which the soul can perceive by means of an innate instinct, Kepler calls archetypes. There is very wide-ranging agreement here with the primordial images or archetypes introduced into modern psychology by Carl Jung, which function as instinctive patterns of ideation. At this stage, the place of clear concepts is taken by images of strongly emotional content, which are not thought, but can be seen pictorially, as it were, before the mind's eye. Insofar as these images are the expression of a suspected but still unknown state of affairs, they can also be called symbolic, according to the definition of a symbol proposed by Jung. As ordering operators and formatives in this world of symbolic images, the archetypes function, indeed, as the desired bridge between sense perceptions and ideas, and are therefore also a necessary precondition for the emergence of a scientific theory. Yet one must be aware of displacing this a priori of knowledge into consciousness and relating it to specific, rational, formulated ideas. Now, what Heisenberg was bothered about with beauty was that physics had been a beautiful science, and quantum mechanics was anything but beautiful. He described it like this. This only came about in full clarity some 50 years ago, when it was realized from the findings in atomic physics that the Newtonian scheme of concepts was no longer adequate to cope with the mechanical phenomena in the interior of the atom. Since Planck's discovery of the quantum of action in 1900, a state of confusion had arisen in physics. The old rules, whereby nature had been successfully described for more than 2 centuries, would no longer fit the new findings. But even these findings were themselves inherently contradictory. A hypothesis that proved itself in one experiment failed in another. The beauty and completeness of the old physics seemed destroyed without anyone having been able, from often disparate experiments, to gain real insight into new and different sorts of connections. I don't know if it is fitting to compare the state of physics in those 25 years after Planck's discovery, which I too encountered as a young student, to the circumstances of contemporary modern art. But I have to confess that this comparison repeatedly comes to mind. The helplessness when faced with the question of what to do about the bewildering phenomena, the lamenting over lost connections, which still continue to look so very convincing. All these disconnects have shaped the face of both disciplines and both periods, different as they are, in a similar manner. We are obviously concerned here with a necessary intervening stage which cannot be bypassed and which is preparing for developments to come. For as Pauli told us, all understanding is a protracted affair inaugurated by processes in the unconscious long before the content of consciousness can be rationally formulated. At that moment, however, when true ideas rise up, there occurs in the soul of him who sees them an altogether indescribable process of the highest intensity. The summation in this piece from Heisenberg is interesting, not only for what it says about beauty, but for what it says about the times he lived in and his reasons for silence. They may lend some understanding to the quantum silence that he and his colleagues contrived and which has lasted for so long. Perhaps at the very end I may remind you once more of the second definition of beauty, which stems from Plotinus, and in which no more is heard of the parts and the whole. Beauty is the translucence, through the material phenomenon of the eternal splendour of the One. There are important periods of art in which this definition is more appropriate than the first, and to such periods we often look longingly back. But in our own time, it is hard to speak of beauty from this aspect. And perhaps it is a good rule to adhere to the custom of the age one has to live in, and to keep silent about that which it is difficult to say. In actual fact, the two definitions are not so very widely removed from one another. So let us be content with the first and more sober definition of beauty, which certainly is also realized in natural science, and let us declare that in exact science, no less than in the arts, it is the most important source of illumination and clarity. Thank you, Mr. Heisenberg.